Hi, everybody. I'll give everyone a second to get a little more settled. We're going to start in a minute or two. So I will start introducing Jess and Susanna. We're really thrilled to have you all here at the Work Center tonight. My name is Rennie. I'm a program assistant here at the Work Center. And most of you are here because you're participating in one of our amazing workshops. But for those who aren't, I'll tell you what the deal is. For 9 weeks every summer, the Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts and writing workshops. And this year, actually, there's some 2-week classes like Susanna's, which is really exciting. If anyone's interested in learning more, you can ask me or any of the staff on hand after the event, and we'll be happy to tell you more about the workshops. One of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week, our world-class faculty mesmerizes our audiences with presentations and talks. And tonight, Jess and Susanna are in conversation, so I'm very excited about that. We're going to hear from Jess T. Dugan, and a photographer, and writer Susanna Sonnenberg. They're going to make a joint presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Books by Jess and Susanna will be available for sale at the back of the room, and Jess and Susanna will be signing their books up here at the front of the room after the event. Or you can sign outside, it's sort of your choice. Books by other members of this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore, which is in the gallery, and there are some at the back of the room as well as some very pretty Work Center merchandise, so feel free to check that out. The new Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event. Right now we're showing an amazing exhibition called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Fine Arts Work Center fellows. The proceeds of all work sold go to support FAWC programs, so be sure to check that out as well. A big shout out to East End Books, who has helped us stock and set up our bookstore. Restrooms are located down the hall that way. And finally, please silence your cell phones. Okay. And now for some brief introductions. Susanna Sonnenberg is the author of 2 memoirs, Her Last Death and She Matters, A Life in Friendships, both New York Times bestsellers. The San Francisco Chronicle called her work painful in its truth and searing in its candor, and noted how compelling her writing is. She also received praise from Oprah magazine, which commended her unflinching eye and winning dispassion. She's taught at FAWC since 2017, and she lives in Montana, where she teaches online writing classes. Jess T. Dugan is an artist whose work explores issues of identity through photographic portraiture. Their work has been widely exhibited and is in the permanent collections of over 40 museums throughout the United States. They are the recipient of a Pollock-Krasner Foundation Grant, an ICP Infinity Award, and were selected by the Obama White House as an LGBT artist champion of change. Their work was described by Vogue as weaving through themes of desire, intimacy, and companionship. The British Photography Journal wrote that their images are cathartic for both viewer and artist, as they assert identity and queerness through their art. Please join me in giving a big FAWC welcome to Susanna and Jess.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I love the quote you pulled, Remy, about catharsis, because we're going to talk about that tonight. And before we jump in, I just wanted to thank everyone at the Fine Arts Work Center for hosting us. I love being here. This is one of my favorite places to teach. I'm so happy to be back in person. Have an amazing group of students, so thank you to my students who are here. And would you like to say a hello before I launch in?
Hello. Thank you, FAWC, for bringing us all together again. Everybody is so happy to be here, and it just keeps being true every day. And it's been a very long time since I have felt that way. So I thank everyone in the administration and the staff for facilitating that, and also my students who have brought so much energy, concentration, and heart every day. Thank you for making all of our time worthwhile. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Me too. And thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight and joining us. So we're going to structure this as a conversation, obviously. And Susanna and I met here at the Work Center in 2017. And we immediately hit it off as both friends and artists. And we were really moved by each other's work in a way that I would say, has been profound and has lingered. And so we knew we were both teaching here this year, and we organized a conversation about many things, but kind of centering around loss and resilience, which are themes that run through both of our work. And we're obviously approaching this from two different angles, Susanna as a writer and me more as a visual artist, although I write a little bit in my new book. So I'm still like really excited. I get to talk to writers. It's like a new thing for me to do this. So, but we wanted to just start tonight's program. Oh, and I also want to say we have a series of questions we're going to go through, and we're each going to answer them. So it will be conversational, but I'll be kind of reading questions throughout. So we wanted to just start the program by asking each other how our work affected the other person, and I would love to have you speak first.
I had really never seen anything like your work when I was introduced to it here in this room. And the images combined with your presence and combined with the way you spoke about them, they felt revelatory and they felt transformative in terms of connecting with another and understanding, understanding a wide range of experience that wasn't primary in my own life. And at the same time, because we always bring everything that we are and everything that's going on in our lives to art when we interact with it, my stepson was transitioning at the time that I first saw your work, and it was so wonderful to imagine his experience being held and seen with so much recognition and vulnerability and compassion. And I thought a great deal about the gift that you were bestowing upon people who were not, well, maybe who were in a better place 5 years ago than they are right now. But the forthrightness, the legitimacy, the unapologetic, the unapologetic honesty and heart that are present in every one of your pictures. I was so excited to share that with my stepson, and it made a huge difference to him, a huge difference, and especially the self-portraits. And I want to ask you about the self-portraits, because what I saw was someone embracing their body and using their body to reach out toward others at a time when he was struggling with managing his own perceptions of his body and finding ways to fit himself into it and it into himself. Can I ask you, I know this is off script already, can I ask you about, and I guess I'm asking this part as a memoirist, but about the use of yourself in your work and the language of your body in your work.
I'm like, am I allowed to do what I do in my workshop, which is we're going to come back to that later in the program. So I'm an Uber planner and Susanna is not. So this is fun. Yes, we can do that now. But before I do that.
Then we can go back to the plan.
Cross out question number 7. I'm just But first, yes, I'm happy to answer that. But first, to answer the question about discovering your work. I think when we were both teaching here, obviously I heard Susanna read and was just really struck by the power of her writing. And it's interesting, a lot of the words you just used, the honesty, directness, all of that I felt in your work as well. And it really moved me. And it's interesting to hear your story about your stepson, because I think that art always connects with us where we're at, and it often finds us in the moment we need it. And you know, people often ask me who I make work for, and I'm very sure that I don't need my work to resonate with everyone, but for those it does resonate with, that's very meaningful to me. And at the time that we met, I was just finishing a video piece called Letter to My Father, which is a biographical video I made with a letter that I read to my father as the soundtrack, and archival images from my family albums overlaid. And this was really me grappling with my estrangement from my father. At that point, we hadn't spoken in about 2 years. So initially through conversations, we talked about specifically in this way, you realize the relationship is not healthy for you, and you choose to make that as opposed to through death or another way. And I then read your memoir and was really your story and the way you spoke about your relationship with your city around it. And I said that just really to me and really resonated with me in terms of how the experience I was going through was not necessarily widely understood. And I remember that you really gave me permission to own what I was feeling around that and to own my own experience. And reading your memoir sort of opened up the space for me to move into my own story. You know, it was newer for me at the time, and even then it was not as new for you. So I think that was really powerful for me, and it really gave me a kind of permission to move forward owning my story. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I think one of the things that I think art does is it provides possibility models, and it affirms identity, and it provides a very visceral experience through which you can relate your own life to someone else's. And I had a very powerful experience with your writing and your book in particular. So the question was, is my body in my work? Yeah. Sort of. So you know, I've always used my work as a way to understand myself, to come to know my place in the world, to connect with other people. And as a way of background, I've been working in photography seriously for about 20 years, and I've always been really interested in portraiture. I've been almost tunnel vision on portraiture until recently when I started making still life images. And for me, I've always, really used my work as a way to process myself. So I've made self-portraits from the very beginning of my practice. It's been a consistent part of what I do. And again, I believe that it can be really powerful to share your own story. And I think to do that in a way that is both strong, so vulnerable in a way, it opens up a space for other people to share theirs and to feel a connection, to feel validated, and to feel seen. We'll come back to more thoughts around that. Number two. This is funny. I didn't know we'd be like kind of teasing each other. So sort of as a broader question, we wanted to talk about these questions of practice. So what does your creative practice look like, and what is the arc of a piece of work or a project?
I am not a planner. I'm not even very disciplined. And my creative practice, I could say what I pretend it looks like, which is that, you know, every morning I shut the door to my office and I'm in there with my thoughts and ideas, and I pull out my notebook that I jot in all the time, but none of that happens. And I know that I've heard writers who do that, but that's not what my creative process looks like. It looks like living my life and every now and then stung by a bee of, some idea, or usually a sentence. And that sentence, I think, this could be the start of something. And then about 6 months after that, I go and write that down. And then I have a lot of frank and disappointed talks with myself about why I'm not working harder. And then I do work hard in like a really intense burst for a while. And I feel really drained of everything that's been kind of building up creatively, and then I'm done. And I don't think that this, this discussion of my creative practice is particularly useful or instructive. I hope it is not instructive to anybody else. But that's, and as a writer, just reading all the time, reading everything that I think is good and filling that reservoir in myself with poetry, most importantly, and then good prose.
I love all the honest answers to creative process. Like when Sarah mentioned the other night, someone asked her about her practice, and she basically just said, it comes easily to me. I don't know, it just always has. It's like, I love the honesty. So I feel the same answer. I think,
Wait, Jess, can you tell us about your creative practice, please?
Sure. Earlier I joked we were going to break into song, and now I think we've discovered comedy, like in real time. So yes, for me, I came to art making pretty young. I discovered art in high school and really hit the ground running with photography when I was 16, 17. And I just have a need to photograph. Like if I don't make photographs for a while, I get antsy and cranky, and it's almost a compulsion for me. I think because it's so intertwined with my life, it's how I relate to people, it's how I connect in a more intimate way than I find I'm able to otherwise. It's how I answer questions about myself. It's how I understand my own family. So there's this way in which it's always a part of me. In a more practical sense, I photograph regularly, but I don't photograph constantly. I don't carry my camera with me all the time. I find the act of looking to be really exhausting. So when I'm photographing someone or making a portrait, I'm super tuned in to them and their energy. I'm looking really carefully. I'm feeling really deeply. I'm thinking about my own emotional state. I'm reflecting on kind of what's happening between me and that person. And when I'm done, I'm exhausted. Like I'm worn out. And I'm also usually really thirsty, which I'm not totally sure what that's about, but I'm always like, I need water. But it's pretty focused. And so, so that's the sort of individual portrait. But then I work in very long-term projects. So I work in, I have three main projects that I conceptualize. One is a project called Every Breath We Drew, which centers around the intersection of individual identity and the need for connection with others. And that's where this work pulls from, even though the images that are behind us are from my new book called Look at Me Like You Love Me, which we'll talk about. So that's one body of work, and I consider that my soul work. I'm always making that work. I'm always meeting people I'm interested in for that work. It's just this ongoing that evolves. And when I make something like a book or an exhibition, I feel like I'm pulling out a chapter or I'm putting parentheses around it, but it's going to keep going. So in a way, this can be hard to grapple with because it's never over, like it's never done. And then I have another body of work photographing my family, which I've also been working on for, at this point, 11 years. And the video piece about my father. So I have this family branch. And then I did make one project that had a clear beginning and end, which was a series of photographs and interviews with transgender older adults. And that had very clear parameters, had more of a documentary mission. And when it was done, it felt done. So that's the only thing that ever really ended. But for me, otherwise, my work is always ongoing, and one thing flows into the next. And I'm kind of fascinated to hear what you say about things building up and then coming out in a burst and then you're done, because for me, that's how the writing happened in this book. And we can double down on that in a little bit, but it definitely felt like it came from somewhere. and had to come out, and then it's like hasn't come again, you know? So it's kind of fascinating. So one thing we really wanted to kind of think about tonight was how an artist or a writer can use their creative practice and work to process themes of trauma and loss. I think those run through both of our works in different ways, but questioning if it's a kind of catharsis, and thinking about, I think when we were planning this conversation, I used the words catharsis and healing interchangeably, and Susanna questioned me on that, thinking, you know, what is the difference between making art as a way to heal versus making art as a way to get something out or move something through you?
What is the question? Okay, how do I use my work to process trauma and loss? I know that when I don't know the answer to something, I write. And that might be something about myself, it might be something about the world, it might be something about other people, but it is and always my way to sort, like to get to make things make sense and to organize. And life isn't organized. And I think that by seizing control of the mess and making something out of it, you are asserting some kind of dominance over the trauma, the loss, you know, things that don't have a shape and things that don't make sense. And we want them to make sense. And I think that for me, I'm always trying to make sense and right, and I never do. I never make full sense, and I never get it right, because for me that is the act of engaging as an artist. Like you're always pushing towards that, but it kind of continues to elude because you keep changing and it keeps changing. And you know, we're going to talk about my memoir that came out in 2008, and I really honestly can barely remember it. And that was the story of my life. But it was only one story. It was one story of my life told in one moment of my life. And it would be completely different. And I think that is really true for all artists. You know, as Jess was saying, you meet the art even as the artist making it in the moment that you're in, and you see what happens. The worst things I've ever written were when I knew what I was going to write. And as far as catharsis, and like the reason I push back against that word was because I reject the idea that making art, except for in art therapy, which is, you know, valuable, but making art isn't to get this out of you and away from you. It's more about how do I take the pain that has formed me and imbue a piece of art with it. What about for you, Jess?
Oh my goodness. I love those things you said, and I love the idea of writing as a way to sort things, because that's such a, like, photographer, that's something I'm so versed in with photography. It's this desire to like make sense and capture and hold on to and organize. And I think in many photographers, there is some compulsion to stop the moment and hang on to things. And I think, of course, that's inherently related to loss. You know, I think I also love what you said about work being made very much of the moment of the maker's life. And I think about work as being a kind of archive. Like, I think we'll talk more about my new book in a minute, but I very much think of it as a marker of who I am in this moment in time and how I make sense of my life time, and I know that what I make in 5 years will be different, and I'm really interested in kind of planting those markers for myself and, you know, for anyone who's interested, but for me specifically as a way to kind of map my own life in a way that makes sense. And I think to the point around trauma or loss, you know, I think that I'm very grateful I have a creative practice, because I think that's a really powerful way to process through trauma or loss. I know for me, you know, perhaps the most direct example was when I was making the video about my father. I would often leave my studio in tears because the process of making it, I looked through every photograph I had from my life, analog, digital, and kind of took this mass survey of images, and it was just brutal to work on. I mean, I don't ever drag my feet as an artist. I'm always like, I want to work. But with this video, I just a hard time like going to do it because it was so emotionally draining. But the process was so healing, and I embarked on that, kind of expecting that I might get to the end and it might not of interest to anyone except for me. And I was totally okay with that. I was like, I have to make this piece. I have no idea if it's going to be awful, cheesy, or, you know, any good, and just kind of embraced that process. And it ended up being so healing. And when I exhibited the work, I was very nervous at first. And, you know, the process of showing it and realizing that people could relate to my story, whether or not their identity was the same as mine. People could relate to this idea around the need to live authentically and what of that is sometimes, sort of what you have to let go of to make that happen. And so the process of exhibiting the work was also really healing for me, which is a whole other phase. And so, so I think my work, and also just briefly, you know, during the pandemic, I made a lot of work, and I was so grateful that I had an outlet to process that. And that really fed into my newest book, very much so. It was affected emotionally and psychologically by the pandemic. But I was actively grateful that I had work and I could kind of put that energy somewhere. So that goes right into question 4.
But before we go to question 4, may I ask you a question? In your new book, you wrote, I understood everything could disappear. And you wrote that as you were talking about work. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to skip to question 5 and talk about my book. Sure.
Just let it go.
Let it go. We're going to let it go.
Get loose.
Okay. I'm trying. I'm so tired, Anna. So I'll talk a little bit about the book. It's called Look at Me Like You Love Me, and it's a collection of photographs and writings. The photographs are mostly from the past 4 or 5 years. There are a few that are earlier, in which you're seeing them all on the screen. And there are about 20 text pieces throughout the book, and some of them are directly about loss. I think that there are themes of loss and beauty throughout the book. And so in my mind, the texts fall into 3 main categories. One being the telling of a specific story or the specific memory of a photograph. The second category being me psychoanalyzing my own need to photograph, why I'm compelled to make photographs, what it does for me. And that category, there's a lot of writing about loss. And then the third category of texts are more explicitly about a kind of desire, whether romantic or sexual, or even just kind of energetic desire to be seen, person, desire to bring your full self forward. So I was thinking about loss, and there are some texts that reference it directly. I do reference the loss of my relationship with my father. There's a text about a friend's death who died by suicide. There's a text about my awareness as a child. My life could fall apart at any time, kind of thinking back to my own upbringing and my parents' divorce and, you know, custody battles and things that were really complicated and difficult. And using photography as a way to kind of hold on to things, to make sense of things. So I think that, you know, running through this book, there are themes of loss and beauty, and I think that either actual loss or the perception of potential loss fuels for me a desire to live authentically and to live urgently and to live in the present. And so I very much see these things as a dual experience. Did that answer your question? Okay. Now we're definitely bouncing around. So yeah, going back to the idea of, I'm interested in this gap between the making of the work and the sharing of the work. And we were talking about this when we were planning for tonight, about how making the work can be healing for the maker. It can also be healing for the viewer. And so I'm interested to ask you about that, experiences with that in terms of your book, but also what happens when there's a time gap between these things, and how, as the artist, you kind of move on. Like you were saying, you can't even remember it. And it's interesting. I just published this book in February, and in a weird way, I'm like emotionally elsewhere. I'm like already on to something else. And it's just kind of interesting to see that gap. So I'm curious if you could talk about, in general, your experience as a maker and how it affects readers, and then that gap of time.
It's so weird to realize that the work is moving away from you. It's drifting off when you spent months or years immersed in it and you knew every contour of it for so long. I wonder what happens to that part of our brains that held all that. Like, does it just go offline forever? Now, I don't know. I think as I have grown as a writer, I have become less attached to my writing. Like I'm really invested in it, and it keeps me sane, and I love making it, although I never experience happiness while I'm doing it. And I just don't, I think that as I've gotten older, I know better that the work is going to have its own life, completely separate from me, and that it is foolish for me to feel bound up in it. I am bound by it and in it when I'm with it, but I now know how to let it live its own life, and to listen to people who are responding to it, which becomes a whole other thing that's really interesting, that I feel is like a way to connect with other people, because we have this piece of art in common, but not because I made it.
Like, are you still thinking? Yeah, so, I think for me, I echo some of the things you said about really understanding that once you put the work out, it's no longer yours. You're not controlling it. And some work feels much more personal to me than others. And so the period of time between when I make it and when I'm willing to launch it is different. The video being the most notable example. It took me years, actually, to get comfortable and talking about that in a more public way. I kind of dipped my toe into some smaller, I showed it in a small exhibition I thought no one would see, and, got some good feedback. I kind of grew from there. So I definitely echo that. And, I've also come to learn that the moment when someone sees your work or relates to your work is something that I value and cherish. I love the way it opens up space for more intimate conversations. I feel like it's kind of like when someone tells you something really personal, it like makes you want to respond, in the same way. And I really value through like exhibitions and lectures and my books how I'm able to connect with people on a much deeper level. And so I love the kind of viewer completing the work. I really value that. And I think, I used to that I had a death grip on photography. I made a portrait. I was like, I have to make it, I have to do a photo shoot, and I have to get a good one. It has to be perfect, and it has to be the. And over my years of maturing as an artist, I've become interested in allowing in some breathing room and embracing subtlety. A lot of my work is about gender and sexuality, and some of it was much more overt, like these are older trans people, and that was kind of what I led with. And in the newer work, I've gone very subtle. There's much more. I think of it as poetic, as a kind of visual poem, especially how this particular book is designed, and even things about the technical craft of how the book was made was meant to be that kind of an experience where someone would just immerse themselves. And I also, so that the texts are related to photographs for me, but I separated them in the book so that there's a lot of ambiguity. And interestingly, I actually couldn't do that. I tried to like separate the text from their source, and I just couldn't, like in the sequence. So the publisher actually had a pretty heavy hand in putting some of this ambiguity in for me. And in my class, we were talking about how as portrait photographers, we're often too close to our work to edit it objectively. And with this book, I really felt that I needed someone to come in and do for me, which I still think is kind of interesting. But I really wanted to leave a lot of entrance points for a viewer. I wanted there to be a lot of different spaces where someone could bring themselves to the work. And I've become increasingly interested in subjectivity and ambiguity and kind of allowing the viewer to come to the work as they will. So let's, I talked a little bit about my book sort of organically, but could you tell us a little bit about the process of writing Her Last Death, and how, if that was healing for you, how that went?
So Jess is referring to this memoir I published in 2008. It was my first book I intended to write, and had I known what it was going to feel like to write it, I wouldn't have written it, except I had to write it. And there is no other way I can explain to you the bind of my relationship with this memoir. I was not a memoir writer. I had written fiction and journalism, but this just sort of fell out of me. And you know, like you, Jess, at one point while I was writing, I like pulled every letter from my mother. The book is focused on my relationship with my mother, who was difficult, and it was the work of my adult life to extricate myself from her and make another path, not the one she had modeled. But I needed to figure out why I had to do that, and I pulled out all these photographs and journals and diaries and letters, and I sat in a room for months with my mother's handwriting. She was not dead, she was alive, but I had severed my relationship with her. But I was flooded with like being 14 at boarding school and getting one of her letters, and like I could physically re-experience it. And I used a lot of that physical awareness as I wrote to bring me back into the places that I was trying to illustrate to a reader. And many times I thought, why am I doing this to myself? Like, I thought I put a lot of this away. I thought I had a lot of perspective and distance on it. And I did, but that was false. And the thing that art demands is that you drop the falseness, you drop the facade, and you get to the most authentic, expression of what you believe and what matters to you. And so now I had a whole new relationship with this material, and from day to day, I never knew what it was going to be. And I was telling my students, I wrote the first like 5 months, and I was so proud of myself, and I was like, well, that's done. I got that told. And then the editor called me and she said, I'm just hoping that you have some kind of epiphany, because this is not the book. And I was like, but I just put everything into it. I gave everything to it. And she was right. I really didn't want her to be right, because I knew it was going to mean a great deal more work, which it was. And it took me another like 15 months to write the second, third, and fourth drafts. And then when I came to write my second book, I actually eased up on myself. Like, what I had learned from the first book is that I didn't need to re-traumatize myself, that I could access a lot of this stuff without doing that, and I could take care of myself along the way. And you know, I don't know how that is in other media, but when you are alone in a room with the words in your head, it can get very dark if you stay that way for hours and hours and days. So I learned to ease up, and the writing became lighter and airier and a little less controlled, which drove me crazy. But I agreed to let that drive me crazy so that I could protect myself a little more the second time around. What about you, Jess?
That question was just for you. I mean, I think that's so interesting. I'm finding myself thinking, like, is there a time sensitivity to some of these things? Like, when you go back and access that, like, your 14-year-old self, like, do you, like, use that up in that accessing process? I mean, this is sort of rhetorical, but I'm thinking about just, like, processing your own life, and is there a certain limit to a quantity of that kind of experience? And then, you know, it's interesting too to think about how you were allowed for less control, because I certainly feel like as I have become more mature in my practice and my work, I'm actively interested in allowing in other elements. Like, it's, I don't know if it's a loss of control. I guess it is. It's, you know, like one tangible example. Yeah, you know, early on, I photographed indoors, often in people's homes, and kind of even light and bedroom spaces. And it was, and I did that for lots of reasons. It was very controllable. And at some point, I decided to start working outside, and, you know, at sunrise and at sunset, and this quickly shifting light. And for me, it was a way of forcing myself to be responsive, of forcing myself to make something that I absolutely couldn't pre-plan. Because I do think if you practice any art form over time, you develop a mastery, and you can almost, like, keep, you know, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound annoying, but I kind of felt like I could go into someone's house and make a picture of them laying on the bed next to the window, and it was going to be good, but it was going to look like something I had already made. It was like, I just didn't want to repeat myself. And I think one thing we talked about in our workshop this week, and that I talk about a lot, is, you know, as an artist, how part of what we do is really learning to follow your own creative voice and to tune into the questions you're asking, and that those change over time, and to try to follow those. So I guess those are just follow-up thoughts to what you said. But I want to go back a little bit to this duality of loss and beauty. And we were talking earlier about how a lot of people are afraid of loss or unwilling to confront it. And so I'm interested, like, at what point did you decide to embrace that in your work, and how do you use it in your work?
I was 11, and I started to write about things that I couldn't understand, or that were causing me grief. And not say the grief of death, but just causing me grief. And so I began to write, and that comforted me. It helped me see, it developed a vocabulary for what I was feeling. And I object to loss, I protest, but I have never pretended it's not there. I don't really feel afraid of it. I feel like, oh, this is going to be another opportunity for my work. What about you, Jess?
We're saying serious things, and then we're joking. Just kidding. Yeah, no, you know, it's interesting because I think in some ways I have embraced a certain kind of, you know, literal loss, like looking back to my childhood that were lost, relationships that were lost, and have grappled with that in my work and made of that in my work, but I also think it just fundamentally informed who I am as a person, which informs the way I view the world and relationships with other people. And so that's very much a part of this work. We had also been talking about how sometimes the loss of something, in particular a relationship, is necessary in order for you to continue to be your authentic self. And so there's a difficulty and sadness around that loss, but then there's like something amazing that comes after, and not amazing, but necessary. At some point you have to protect who you are, and that requires you losing certain things. And, the other thing I think about is my own identity as someone who identifies as queer and non-binary, and I presented this way from a very young age, and I grew up in Arkansas, and so I grew up with this heightened awareness around my own difference and my own exclusion from mainstream society. I think, of course, there were things that were difficult in that, but I also think always positioned me as just a little bit outside. And I think that is somehow connected to loss, but then there's also an immense freedom in that. So I think for me, that experience, sort of my lifelong experience of fundamentally not fitting into mainstream systems, is fed into my work. And I think there's a strong theme of making space in my work. I'm actually going to read one text here. And I think that comes from not having that space made for me, certainly by my father, but sometimes just by the world at large. So I'm going to read you one text. I told Susannah that if I had to pull out one text, I think this is kind of the thesis text of the book. Okay. You pull him close, his head resting on your chest, eyes closed. Your skin glows golden. Your gaze is direct, open, gentle. I have always been drawn to the owning, the claiming. This is who I am, you say. This is who I love. It is not easy being you and me. The world pushes against us, asks us to roughen the parts of us that are tender, requires us to code switch and self-protect. We spent a lifetime learning that what we know to be true is not what others hope for. But the pull is too great, the cost of turning away too high, and so we forge ahead. Shoulder the loss, embrace the growth. We find one another somehow and learn to name ourselves, to embody our truths and own our desires. We act as mirrors, reflect each other, see ourselves anew. What is it I have been looking for all of these years? What am I chasing? I want to be close, but I also want to become. I want you to reflect all of the myself I find it difficult to name, to exist for a moment solely in the space between us. I want to see myself reflected in you. Over and over, I invite myself in. Let me look at you, I say, closely, quietly, for a long time. Let us fall into a rhythm, my photographing in lockstep with your breathing, my attention astute. I will hold your tenderness, honor your struggle, respect your strength. All of this time in bed sheets and bathtubs, in fields of violets and prairie grasses, in intimate gazes and gentle gestures, I have been looking and creating space for myself. Thank you. So I think as a way, we're close to time here, so I think as a way of finalizing this part of the conversation before we hear your questions, which I hope you have and we would love to take, what are the places you still can't access yet as an artist? What are your challenges for future work? And then thinking even when you're established or mid-career, how do you continue to push yourself to grow as an artist?
Steal from my students? No, guys, I don't do that. Well, what I was thinking listening to you read was I'm filled with respect for the guts it takes to push yourself to go to places artistically that you have not yet become entirely comfortable in. And I mean, that's what you've told me, like that there's discomfort for you in writing because it's new to you. And I don't want to go back to that feeling of being uncomfortable. Like, I really like what I've learned about writing and writing well, and I I just want to hang out there. And I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things I learned during the pandemic at home, not writing, was that I could start to be bad at some things, and I could let go of needing them to be as perfect as I try to make my writing be, because I think that I have to and I owe it to myself, blah, blah, blah. But like, I would never be able to show like my drawing or my painting, other media to people. So I think you actually have the answer to this question, like how you grow and how you challenge yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you know, I was thinking about this question, and you know, in some ways, the things that I have yet to access or am trying to access just have to come to me. They have to develop. I was thinking about my own process in therapy, for example, kind of working things out and uncovering different layers, and all of that feeds back into the work that I'm making. So I think as a person and an artist, I feel like I can access places now that I just didn't have self-awareness of 6 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think that's part of it, is that we just continue to develop as people, and then that comes into your work somehow. You know, I try really hard at this point in my career to not think about the reception of the work when I'm making it. And I think that can be a challenge, especially when you've had visibility and when people latch on to a certain of what you do and kind of come to expect something. I think it can be hard to let that go, but as artists, we all have to evolve and grow and make something different and follow the work where it goes. So I really try to do that, to give myself space to create without thinking about a show or a book or an audience, or, you know, how someone will write about the work or any of that, to just tune in as much as I can to myself. And I do have this way of photographing from a very intuitive and visceral place, including who I choose to photograph and what kind of images I want to make. And I really try to just go with that, and then look at it intellectually later to kind of separate those things. And I think, you know, for this book, that was really, because I did, the pictures are from many years, but the writing was from a 6-month period. And I, like Susannah had talked about earlier, I just kind of had this writing coming out of me, and I had this sense that I had to protect it. Like, I didn't want to show it to anyone early until I felt like it was out, because I didn't want too much input. And it was interesting, actually, when we made the book manuscript, it didn't occur to me that the editor would edit my writing, which is so funny, because, like, of course that should occur to me, but I've just never I've worked with so many picture editors, but I've never worked with a text editor, and he cut like a third of it, and I was like so offended at first. When I got it back, I was like shocked, and then I was like, I know enough. I said to myself, give it 24 hours. He's probably right. It'll be fine. But, you know, so anyway, it was just, but I had of like, and I was open to the editing and the feedback then, but I had this protectiveness around the making. I knew I just needed to make in kind of a cocoon and then edit later and reflect later. And so, yeah, now I feel like I'm going on and on, but I guess I just, you know, I continue to push myself to grow by trying new things and really trying to push my work forward and complicate it, and not rest on what I'm good at or what is easy or familiar, or try to find that thing that makes me a little uncomfortable or a little excited or feels new and different. So, and it's interesting you talk about, you know, when you're writing, not experiencing happiness, because I do think there's and I was thinking for myself, like, I love making portraits. Like, I'm generally happy with photographing, but right before, I always like hope that the person cancels because I'm really nervous. You know, there's always a little part of me that's like, maybe this won't happen. So there is a part that it's challenging, and it you know, it requires you bringing a certain kind of vulnerability over and over and over. But ultimately, I just really rewarding. All right, so I think we're at a good moment to open it up for questions, and I believe there's a microphone for the audience.
There is a microphone for the audience. Can you hear? Is this okay? Okay. When you ask a question, if you could repeat it into the microphone so those joining us via Zoom land could hear, that would be fantastic.
Hi, thank you. This is a great talk. I am really curious to hear about the flowers because it seems like maybe that's something that's newer. I'd love to hear you talk about when you brought those in. You said still lives generally, but especially the flowers. Can you say some things about that part of your work?
Sure, of course. Yeah. So, like I said, I've always primarily made portraits. In Every Breath We Drew, I had made used still life images in earlier work, but they were things like pairs of pillows or two sets of boots. They were very, they were meant to reference a relationship or the need for a relationship in a kind of perhaps more direct way. I think with the newer still life images, they're doing a couple things. One is that I really, I'm thinking of my work more in sequence now than I ever have before, whether it's an exhibition or a book. And I think of the kind of lyricism of different photographs hitting different notes emotionally. And so I'm playing with that a lot more. I can't have, a lot of my earlier work was like, frontal portrait, intense eye contact. And, I realized you can't, I didn't want to do that over and over. I really wanted to vary the tone. And so that was part of it. But also, I made most of those flower images during the pandemic and when I was home alone. And, I wasn't thinking of this consciously when I started making them, but I think they were a way for me to process existential questions around being alive, life and death, about time. All of my work is really about light. And I think it's very much true in the photographs too. And I also think of the temporal quality of light as also being about time and life and death. So I think that the flowers really played that role for me. They were a way for me to bring those questions. And a lot of the spreads in the book have a flower image across from a portrait. And so they're really meant to be in dialogue and inform one another. Sure.
Hi, for Susanna, I'd love to hear about what you're working on now, and if there's anything you want to share from or about.
I do not want to talk about it. No.
And that's fair too.
No.
I just think you're spectacular, and I would love to hear about what you're.
Thank you. My husband says to me, like, what were you doing today? You were writing? What were you writing? And I immediately shut down, freak out, leave the house. And I think it's partly what Jess is talking about, like being very protective of something that is tender and knowing, and you're not ready to expose it to the world, and you're not ready, your ego is not ready to hear any thoughts from anyone else. And I'm really protective of that time. But I'd say what I'm working on now is the loss and trauma that I experienced 10 years ago. So I 10 years until I could work with it. And believe me, I tried in the intervening years, but no good. Of going through divorce and the dissolution of a family that had been so important to me to build with someone else, and the loss of that person in my life. Thank you for asking. I cannot believe I just told you that, but only you.
My question is for Jess. You talked about roaming around and looking around and being in the moment of taking the photograph. How do you, or do you know when to go click? And if it doesn't work, do you click again, or do you walk away, try to do something else? Or how do you just really know? Is that experience always the same, or is it different?
That's a great question. Thank you. So in some ways it's the same, and in some ways it's not, because I'm always looking for something a little bit new. But for me, the way that I work when I'm photographing, it's really a process of me working my way into the portrait with someone. So my camera's on a tripod. I use slow shutter speeds. There's a lot of conversation back and forth. It's a fairly formal, just in terms of how I'm constructing the photograph kind of interaction. So it's often me, trying certain poses, looking at the light, seeing what works visually, and then from there really fine-tuning on the emotion and the expression. So I feel that there is an arc to making a portrait. There's a process of me finding the photograph, and also the person I'm photographing, of us like settling into an emotional space together. And then I feel like in most shoots for me, there's a moment where I feel like everything comes together, like the form, the light, the person's expression, and I can always feel it. I'm like, wow, like it strikes me that worked, that there was a magic moment. And sometimes it's really quick and then it goes away. And I also find that the arc of the portrait, I feel like what am I trying to say? Like the person loses energy at some point, right? So I feel like there's this moment where everything builds to the crescendo and then it kind of passes. And no matter how many pictures I made after that, it wouldn't be there. So a big part of what I do is try to tune into that arc, and it's a little bit different for each person. Some people are much more comfortable in front of a camera than others, so the amount of time it might take us to get there varies. So I think I generally have a sense, I know after a shoot which image was the one. Like I have one that burns in my memory that I know. And sometimes I really wish there were other ones that were good. Like I often have this moment where I'm like, I want this one to work, but I know it doesn't. And so I'm aware of that. And then, some people I photograph many times over and over. And so I also think that process is a little different once I come to know someone really well, of trying to push even farther, or to go even farther together, to see kind of how emotional of a space we can get to and make even more intimate photographs. Your point about your ego not being ready to put things out also just made me think of school. I was just I joke that I cried my way through grad school because I was just never ready. It was too fast. I was like, I can't make something and show you 3 weeks later. When I finished, I was like, whew, I have a much longer arc, So.
Just there are two images there where two people are in the middle of a landscape, whereas many of the rest are close up. And I wondered what's your relationship with them, the landscape that you chose to place them in that situation rather than as you have many of the others?
Thank you. Yeah, so the influence of landscape has become much more significant in my work, and I think part of that is that I moved to St. Louis 8 years ago from Chicago and then from Boston before that. And my environment changed. I live near a really big, beautiful park, and I spend a lot of time there, and I think on some level it was just personal experience and where I found myself, but the landscape of Missouri has kind of ingrained in me. Also the landscape of this place, actually. I photograph here quite a bit, and there's a lot of water in the book as well, both in Provincetown and elsewhere. So in some ways it happened kind of naturally. I think the other shift was what I mentioned about trying to seek out different kinds of light and different kinds of situations. But then I think also in hindsight, in the coming to understand my work after the moment of making it, I've been thinking a lot about queerness in the landscape, and in an expansive landscape, in an organic setting, a natural setting, and how that reads differently than in a private domestic setting. And I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in that conversation. So I think the ones you noticed where I'm pulled much further away feel newer for me, and I think I'm still kind of moving in that direction.
Let me ask a follow-up question. How does it read differently? What's the difference between how the body reads domestic landscape versus the natural landscape to you, the way you view it?
Sure. I mean, I think in a way I'm still kind of teasing it out, but I think one of the more sort of overt things is the notion of private versus public and sort of taking queerness out of a private space. But I also think there's a link between the sort of nature element or the organic element and how like queerness or gender expansiveness is really natural and innate in people, and so I'm interested in that link. And this is maybe a rabbit hole or something different, but there's also this element of beauty in all of that I think is really important, thinking about like the beauty of the landscape, the beauty of the light falling on a body, and thinking about kind of how we experience our lives through these very physical incarnations and physical surroundings. But I think in some ways I'm still teasing it apart. It's interesting. I've worked very closely with a photo curator in St. Louis, and at one point I was like, talk to me about landscape. Like I'm suddenly making pictures in the landscape, and I've spent 20 years doubling down on portraiture, but I don't know anything about landscape. So I'm sort of mid-process, I think.
I was just really inspired by what you said about reclaiming the landscape, because there's so much about queerness being unnatural, and yet there's a long history of us being free in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. And so I love that. But before that, I wanted to ask why both of you choose to teach here, and what you hope to impart on your students, and also what that does for you as an artist in this time when you actually are working with students, and what you take away.
That's a great question. You want to start?
It is a great question. Thank you. This is a rare environment. It is special for how small and intimate it is. It seems to attract people who really care about what they're making, and people who really want to grow in what they're making. And as a teacher, that is the most ideal student. That person who is curious and open and willing to risk. And I think that there's a great deal of safety here, as well as permission. And of course, Provincetown has just this long history of liberation and permission. And that attracts both educators and students here.
Yeah, totally. And I echo a lot of things that Susanna said. And I love the immersive environment here. I love the particularities of this place and the history of the place. I love teaching. I find it very rewarding. I love working with students. I love working with other people who are passionate about their craft. To be totally blunt, I don't like all the stuff in academia that comes with teaching. And so I really love these kinds of environments where it's, the students are self-selecting, like you said, they really are hungry to be here and want to work with you. I'm always amazed how much happens in a week. Like I feel like there's like a time warp here where it's like you have so much growth and get so much done because it's this very concentrated, like immersive place where there is all of this freedom and all of this encouragement. So I really love that. And then of course I love, being in Provincetown and the community that's here and everyone I meet. I mean, there are people here tonight who I met in workshops of years past, and I love the community element.
That could be a fabulous way to wrap up. Sure.
All right, thank you all so much.
Thanks, Jess. That's great. Okay, thank you so much. Maybe one more round of applause for Jess and Susanna. That was awesome. So just a reminder, they will be signing books for a little while after. You can find books on the back table here and in the bookstore, which is in the gallery. And the gallery will be open for a little while after the talk. All right, thank you so much.